I hadn't expected it to just be the two of us. The plan was simple, a weekend hunting trip with my son and his best friend. Something I'd done with my own father at that age. Early mornings, cold air, the stillness of the forest. But at the last minute, my son called to say he couldn't make it. Deadlines. Projects. College life had swallowed him whole. Ethan still wanted to come. He showed up at my driveway that Friday afternoon, grinning, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He looked younger than his 21 years and older all at once. His hair was messy, his jacket too thin for the cold, but his eyes were bright, eager in a way I remembered from when he was a boy. "Guess it's just you and me, Mr. Callahan," he said. I almost told him we should reschedule, but he had that hopeful look. The one kids get when they're trying not to seem disappointed. I couldn't bring myself to shut it down. So we went. The drive was long, the kind of winding road that forces conversation. He filled the car with stories, professors who made no sense, a girl who'd broken his heart, music he thought I should try. I laughed at his dramatics, shook my head at his taste. But every now and then, when the road stretched quiet, I'd catch him watching me. Not just glancing but looking. Like he was studying me. At first I thought I imagined it. Maybe he was just zoning out, staring at the reflection of passing trees in the window. But then I felt it again, that steady gaze. When I turned, he didn't flinch away. He just smiled a little, almost as if he knew I'd caught him. It made me clear my throat, focus harder on the road. The cabin was exactly as I'd left it the year before. Small, drafty, smelling faintly of cedar and old smoke. He wandered through it like it was a museum, touching the rough wood walls, peering at the antlers mounted above the fireplace. "Feels like stepping into another time," he said. I nodded. "That's the point." He claimed the bunk against the far wall, tossing his bag down with a thud. For a moment, standing there in the dim light, I realized how much taller he was now. My memory of him was always tied to sleepovers at our house, my son and him sprawled across the living room floor with video games. But this was different. He wasn't a boy anymore. That evening we sat outside, the fire crackling, sparks snapping up into the night sky. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. Ethan leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees, his face flickering in the orange glow. "Did you always come up here with your dad?" he asked. "Most years," I said. He believed a man should know how to sit still in the woods. Said it teaches patience. Ethan smirked. "And did it?" I thought about it, poked at the fire with a stick. Maybe. Or maybe it just gave me an excuse to sit quiet without having to explain myself. He didn't answer right away. When I finally glanced up, his eyes were on me again. Steady. Searching. Something in my chest tightened. The fire popped loudly, breaking the moment. He smiled faintly, but he didn't look away. I shifted in my chair, tried to laugh it off. But inside, a strange unease curled in my stomach. It wasn't bad exactly. Just unfamiliar. Later, as we doused the fire and headed inside, he brushed past me at the door. His shoulder grazed mine, light, accidental. Still, I felt it long after. In the dark cabin, as I lay down on my bunk, I found myself staring at the ceiling. I told myself it was nothing. That he was just my son's friend, just a kid I'd known for years. But the way he looked at me, like I was something worth really seeing, stayed in my mind long after his breathing evened into sleep. And deep down, though I wouldn't have admitted it to anyone, not even to myself, I knew that something about this trip was already different. The first morning broke colder than I expected. When I stepped outside, frost clung to the cabin steps, and the woods were wrapped in a thin veil of fog. Ethan came out behind me, rubbing his hands together, his breath clouding in the air. "You weren't kidding about it being cold," he said, his teeth flashing as he grinned. "Best way to wake up," I told him, though I pulled my jacket tighter. We set out before the sun fully crested the horizon, rifles slung across our backs. He walked close beside me, his boots crunching in rhythm with mine. The woods were hushed still. We followed deer tracks that disappeared into the undergrowth, and though we never saw anything worth raising our rifles for, he didn't seem to mind. After hours we stopped on a fallen log to eat. I handed him a strip of jerky and a bottle of water. He tugged off his jacket, sighing, steam rising faintly from his shirt as his body cooled from the hike. The fabric clung to him, outlining muscle I hadn't realized he had. His shoulders had broadened since the last time I'd paid real attention, his chest more defined. I caught myself staring. He noticed. His head tilted, a half-smile forming. Something wrong? I looked away quickly, focusing on the trees. Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. And the word sounded strange in my mouth, like I was trying to convince myself more than him. When we returned to the cabin, the old heater sputtered and coughed but never caught. I cursed under my breath, fiddled with the controls, but the thing was dead. "Guess it's us and the fire," Ethan said, dragging his sleeping bag closer to the hearth. He didn't seem disappointed. If anything, he looked amused. I did the same, unrolling my bag beside his. The firelight painted the room in soft, shifting gold. The air smelled of pine and smoke. It should have been nothing, two men stretched out near a fire, tired from the hunt. But as the hours ticked by, I felt the space between us shrink. At first it was small things, his elbow brushing mine when he shifted, the warmth of his shoulder grazing me as he pulled the blanket tighter. I told myself not to think about it, but the brushes became longer, lingering. Finally, he shifted fully closer, his arms settling so near to mine I could feel the heat radiating off his skin. I lay stiff on my back, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the fire pop. My pulse was loud in my ears, my breath shallower than it should have been. I thought about sliding a few inches away, reclaiming the distance. But I didn't. When I turned my head slightly, I found him already watching me. His face was calm, but his eyes held something steady, deliberate. I looked away fast. The silence between us was heavy, louder than any words could have been. It didn't feel accidental. It didn't feel casual. It felt too close. Too deliberate. And whatever it was not nothing. The morning after was different. We moved through the motions, brewing coffee over the fire, pulling on boots, heading back into the woods. But something unspoken pressed down between us. It wasn't heavy in a bad way. It was heavy like the air before a storm, when you know the sky is about to break but you can't say when. Ethan didn't chatter as much. He walked beside me, quiet, his rifle balanced easily in his hands. Every now and then he'd glance my way as though waiting for me to say something. I didn't. I kept my eyes on the trees, though I felt his gaze like a hand on my shoulder. We tracked along the ridge until the sun rose high. At one point, I crouched to study a set of prints pressed into the mud, fresh, maybe a deer, maybe a stray dog. He crouched beside me, so close our sleeves brushed. I should have shifted away, but I didn't. I could feel the warmth of him, steady, grounding. The silence stretched long. I could hear his breathing, slow and even, almost in rhythm with mine. I cleared my throat, pointed at the prints, muttered something about how the ground was too soft to tell. He nodded, but he didn't move. For a moment, it was just us kneeling there in the damp earth, shoulders touching, the forest around us hushed. Back at the cabin later, the quiet followed us in. He sank into the chair by the fire, staring at the flames. His face looked softer in the light, less boyish than I remembered, though there was still something vulnerable in the set of his mouth. Out of nowhere, he said, "Do you ever feel like people don't really know you? Not the real you?" I froze. The question sounded casual, but his voice carried weight. I set down the mug in my hands. "Sometimes," I admitted. "More often than I'd like to admit." He looked up then. His eyes were sharp, intent, as though my answer mattered more than it should. "What do you do with that?" he asked. His voice was low, not pushing but waiting. I let out a breath, rubbed my palms together. The truth came out slower than I intended. "Mostly? I just live with it. You get used to being the person people think you are. It's easier that way." His jaw tensed like he didn't like that answer. Then he leaned back, gaze dropping to the fire again. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, alive. I could almost hear the words neither of us said, hovering just out of reach. I thought about telling him more, about how often I felt like a stranger in my own life, about how the cabin had always been my escape from expectations I couldn't meet. But the words stuck in my throat. Old habits. Years of keeping things unsaid. So instead, I added another log to the fire. Sparks jumped, crackling in the air. When I sat back, I found his eyes on me again. Steady. Not accusing, not curious, just searching. Like he was looking for something in me he hoped was there. I held his gaze longer than I should have. Long enough to feel the quiet between us shift into something almost fragile. And in that silence, I realized something had already changed. It wasn't in the words. It wasn't in the things we admitted or held back. It was in the silence itself. The kind of silence that said more than speech ever could. That night the cold came back sharper than ever. The wind rattled against the cabin walls and even the fire seemed to struggle, throwing more smoke than heat. We laid our sleeping bags close again, closer than I'd planned, the flames our only source of warmth. I told myself I should shift farther away, give space. But the cabin floor was hard and the cold pushed me toward the fire, and toward him. We lay there for a while in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound. I kept my eyes on the ceiling beams, tracing the dark outlines, trying to will myself to sleep. But every time he shifted I felt it. The soft rustle of fabric, the faint brush of his sleeve against mine. At some point his hand slid over. Just a few inches. Enough that the back of his fingers brushed against my arm. I froze. It wasn't an accident. I could feel the difference. A stumble is quick, fleeting. This was deliberate, careful, almost testing. I should have moved. Should have pulled away, set the line. But I didn't. I stayed still, my chest tight, my pulse quickening in my ears. His hand lingered there, not grabbing, not holding, just resting. The kind of touch you don't give unless you mean something by it. I stared at the ceiling, every nerve in my body awake. My instinct said to speak, to break the silence, to make a joke. But I couldn't. My voice wouldn't come. Instead, I let the moment stretch. Minutes passed, maybe more. My arm grew warm beneath the light press of his skin. The fire cracked and hissed, and still he didn't move. When I finally dared to glance at him, his eyes were closed, his face calm. But there was something in his expression, a softness, a trust, that made my chest ache. I lay there, caught between two truths, that he was my son's friend and that he was no longer a boy. That he wasn't mine to hold, and yet he had chosen to reach for me anyway. The touch stayed. Even after sleep finally crept in, it stayed. And when I woke at dawn, his hand had slipped back, tucked close to his chest as though nothing had happened. He didn't mention it. Neither did I. But the memory of it burned brighter than the fire had. It was a small thing, simple and wordless. Yet it was the kind of touch you don't forget. The kind that doesn't let you go. By the fourth day the hunt barely mattered anymore. We carried our rifles, walked the trails, but neither of us truly looked for deer. The woods became more of a backdrop than a purpose. What filled the air instead was something heavier, quieter. We stopped for lunch along a ridge where the ground dropped away into a valley of pines. The air was crisp, the sky a pale wash of gray. Ethan sat against a fallen log, pulling off his gloves. His hair was mussed from the wind, his cheeks flushed. He looked both tired and alive in a way I couldn't quite name. For a while we ate in silence, chewing jerky, sipping water. Then he spoke, so softly I almost didn't catch it. It doesn't feel like nothing, you know? I froze, a strip of jerky halfway to my mouth. My eyes darted to him. What doesn't? He met my gaze, steady but nervous. Last night. The other nights. All of it. You act like it's nothing, but... He shook his head. It doesn't feel like nothing to me. I swallowed hard, throat dry. The words I'd been avoiding pressed at the back of my teeth. I don't know what this is, I admitted, my voice low. But it doesn't feel like nothing to me either. The relief on his face was subtle, but I saw it. His shoulders dropped, his mouth curved in the smallest, tentative smile. Neither of us spoke for a long time after that. The forest hummed with wind through the branches, the distant call of a bird. My chest ached with the weight of the truth we'd finally let slip. Then quietly he shifted closer. Not much, just enough that his sleeve brushed mine. He leaned his head against my shoulder, letting out a long breath. I didn't move. I couldn't. The warmth of him there, the trust of it, was something I hadn't realized I'd been starving for. My eyes closed without meaning to, the weight of his head grounding me, anchoring me to the moment. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. The world around us went on, unchanged. The sky stretched above, the trees swayed, the earth held steady beneath us. But inside me something shifted. It was terrifying. It was quiet. And it was real. That night something shifted. Not loud or sudden, just subtle, like the way a river carves a new path without anyone noticing until years later. We didn't pretend anymore. Not about the closeness, not about the silence. After dinner we sat by the fire without filling the space with words. It didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like trust. Like we didn't need to force anything. Ethan stretched out on the rug, hands folded behind his head. His face was lit by the orange glow, shadows softening his features. For a moment he looked like the boy I'd known years ago, sprawled on my living room floor, staying up too late with my son. But then he laughed at something small, a low warm sound, and I saw him as he was now. A man. You know, he said, turning his head toward me, you're not half as scary as I thought you were when I was a kid. I chuckled. Scary? He grinned. Yeah. You always had this quiet thing. Like you saw more than you said. Made me nervous. And now? I asked. His eyes softened. Now it just feels like you listen. Like you really see people. The words hit me deeper than I expected. For years I'd carried this sense that no one really did see me, not fully. And here he was, saying it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I didn't know what to say back, so I didn't. Instead, I sat down on the rug beside him, close enough to feel the heat of the fire and the heat of him. We ended up talking for hours. About little things at first, music, school, how bad I was at cooking. He teased me about burning the eggs that morning, and I teased him about missing every shot he took in the woods. But slowly the conversation turned heavier. He told me about the loneliness he felt on campus, how even surrounded by people he sometimes felt invisible. I admitted to the silence I carried at home after my divorce. How the house felt too big, too empty when my son wasn't there. At some point our knees brushed. Neither of us moved. The fire burned low, shadows thickening around us, but the warmth between us was more than enough. He nudged me with his shoulder, smiling faintly. "You're easier to talk to than most people my age. Maybe I just don't interrupt as much," I said, and he laughed again, soft and genuine. The sound made something inside me loosen. When the fire dimmed to embers, the cabin was wrapped in a hush that felt almost holy. He shifted closer, his face only inches from mine now. He didn't rush, didn't push. He just leaned in, slow enough that I could feel his breath against my skin, warm and careful. My heart pounded so hard I thought he must hear it. And then his lips brushed mine. It wasn't a kiss the way people think of kisses. It was barely there, a whisper of contact, the softest touch. More question than statement. More permission than claim. I didn't pull away. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The fire crackled, the wind rattled faintly against the cabin, and still I felt nothing but him. The gentleness of it, the courage it took. When he drew back, his eyes searched mine, waiting for something. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I just let my forehead rest lightly against his, and we stayed like that, breathing the same air, sharing the same quiet. It was nothing dramatic. No fireworks, no declarations. But it felt like the answer to a question I hadn't even realized I'd been asking my whole life. I didn't know I was waiting. Not until he showed me I had been. The last morning arrived with rain. A soft patter on the roof, steady and unhurried. It wasn't the kind of storm that demanded attention, just a reminder that time was moving on, that our weekend was drawing to a close. I lay awake for a long while, listening to the rhythm of it. Ethan was still asleep beside the fire, curled in his sleeping bag, his hair a mess, his face relaxed. The boyishness was back in that moment, but threaded with something new, something I couldn't unsee now. I watched him breathe, steady and unguarded, and a strange ache settled in my chest. Eventually he stirred, blinking at me through the quiet. "Morning," he mumbled, voice rough from sleep. "Morning," I said softly. We didn't rush. There was no need. We packed slowly, folding sleeping bags, tucking gear back into bags. Every movement felt heavier than it should have, like each sound was marking the end of something we weren't ready to let go of. Over breakfast I burned the eggs again. Ethan laughed, shaking his head, scraping the pan with a fork. "You really weren't kidding about being a terrible cook." I shrugged. "I have other talents." "Like glaring at me in the woods when I miss every shot?" he teased. "That's one of my strongest skills," I admitted, and we both laughed. But when the laughter faded, the quiet returned. Not uncomfortable, just full. Every glance between us seemed to hold something unsaid. By the time we loaded the truck, the rain had thinned to a drizzle. Ethan slung his bag over his shoulder, then paused at the cabin door. He turned back to me, his hand gripping the strap of his duffel. "I don't know what happens now," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. I stood there, my own bag at my feet, staring at him. The truth pressed at me, that I didn't know either. That I couldn't map this out or name it, not without breaking something delicate. "Neither do I admitted. My throat felt tight, but the words came anyway. "But I know I don't want to undo this." Something softened in his face. A smile, small and genuine, tugged at the corners of his mouth. He nodded once as if that was enough. And maybe it was. The drive home was different from the drive up. Quieter, yes, but not empty. The silence was no longer a gap to be filled. It was a space we shared, thick with everything we didn't need to explain. Every so often he'd glance at me, a half smile on his lips, and I'd find myself smiling back without meaning to. When the town finally came into view, a dull ache settled into my chest. I knew the rhythm of normal life would press back in soon. Work, responsibilities, the roles we'd been playing for years. But the cabin had carved something out of me I hadn't realized was there. Ethan shifted in his seat, watching the road ahead. "Feels weird," he murmured. "What does?" I asked. "Going back. Like I'm leaving something behind, even though I don't know what to call it." I gripped the wheel tighter, swallowing hard. His words hit too close. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I know the feeling." We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. The air was thick with enough understanding to last the rest of the drive. When I pulled into his driveway, he lingered a moment before opening the door. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean. He looked at me, eyes steady, and for a second, it felt like we were still back at the cabin, the fire crackling, the silence wrapping around us like a blanket. "Thanks for taking me," he said. Simple words but heavy all the same. "Anytime," I replied. My voice was steady but inside, everything trembled. He gave me one last smile, then climbed out, slinging his bag over his shoulder. I watched him walk up the path, watched the door close behind him, and for a moment the truck felt unbearably quiet. I sat there, rain dripping from the eaves, my hands still on the wheel. I thought about the way he'd looked at me that first night by the fire. About the brush of his hand against mine. About the quiet confession on the ridge, his head leaning against my shoulder. About the almost kiss that had felt more like a truth than anything I'd ever said aloud. I thought about how I hadn't expected this. How I hadn't asked for it. But also how I wouldn't undo it. Not for anything. Whatever this became, whatever name it might take or road it might follow, I knew one thing for certain. It was real. And it was mine now, in a way that nothing else had been in a very long time.